Hi everybody, my name is Darren. I work as an architectural assistant in Cambridgeshire. I'm the 3 times great grandnephew of the builder of the estate at Stoke Newington. The estate runs along Bethune Road and Manor Roads. Does anybody actually live on the estate? Or does anybody live near the estate? Oh, so you're all aware, sort of roughly aware of that, yeah, the big long estate of buildings that run right round that corner? Yes, yeah. Well, we're going to sort of go into a little bit of the history of Matthew Allen, who built the estate, and then tell you about the estate itself and where it came from, sort of all the ideas behind it and why it looks so different from everything else. So, just sort of an overview of the estate and looking at the whole area, and people forget this little area up here is actually a row of 3 terraces that are also part of the estate on the opposite side of the road, which is just off of shot. So, we're starting with the roots of where Matthew Allen came from. He actually came from Cambridgeshire, where I come from. So he comes from the same village in Brampton. And ironically, we live in a house also built by him. Yes, and it has a lot of the parts used in the Allen estate on the house as well. So we're sort of down there. Ironically, that there is built by one of his descendants. But just going ahead. Matthew Allen started working for his father in Brampton, and his father was a carpenter, and Matthew Allen himself was a bricklayer. He also did a bit of cast iron work, and he's also done stuff with boilers. So he was started off in London working bits and boilers. And when he arrived in London in the 1830s, London was a very different place to what it is now. Definitely not thriving. And it was sort of thought of as a rotten centre, because if you looked at the type of housing there was Georgian housing, but it was set by the Building Act. So they set a set of things, a bit like a building control, sort of how a house should be built, but they gave 3 different types of house. And the problem was with the 3 different types of house, people literally copied the houses from the Act. And this was the result that London became incredibly uniform, and it ended up looking like that. So whether you were wealthy, middle class, lower, and that's what every street nearly looked like at the time. There are still sections that are still there, but have been interrupted by sort of Victorian additions and changes, so there's a bit more variation nowadays. But, and if you didn't live there, you lived here, which was places were sort of, note the number of shoes, and how people lived in that doorway, basically. And if you couldn't have that, there was an example of a house that I found which was unbelievable. If you didn't live there, at the right at the bottom end, you lived there. That's in Halifax, but that's an example of a house that was built with no windows. That was real, people lived in them. And there was no windows in the back either. So this is the London he arrived in. And as a result of all this, there's a lot of social tensions. And across Europe, it spread out from France, and it started with the 1848, and it was the revolutions that happened as a result of Parliament challenging the King, and also revolutionaries also then challenging the Parliament. So you had a lot of civil unrest in France, workers' unions, and all different groups across society, right the up middle classes, even to the lower upper classes, were caught as a large amount of conflict. And it also spread, if you saw here, parts of the streets back then were quite narrow, so it was quite easy to barricade. And this is which will later influence the designs of buildings. As you can see, a lot of these buildings look obliquely on. You see that they're quite small buildings, and they're all designed for narrow streets, so you see them sort of side on. You don't really have a long building as such. They're all built in one style. So, and in Britain, we had free trade, and we also had the Chartist movement for men's suffrage, which is the men to get the right to vote. Because unless you own property, or even a modicum of land, you couldn't vote at all, even if you were a man. So you had to have owned a significant amount of property to be able to achieve the vote. And there's one of the Chartist leaders, William Lovett, who was actually a friend of Matthew Allen. And there he is riding a sort of carriage through, taking a petition to Parliament, which was eventually successful. Well, there was a response to all of this. So not only was there overcrowding, there was civil unrest, London was a bit of a mess, and so were many other capitals across Europe. predominantly France. So there's a lot of interchange between French ideas and British ideas. And this is an example of the building that was used, Prince Albert's model dwelling house, Henry Roberts. This was a house done for, as an example, what could be built, as concrete floors in between, brickwork exterior, balconies and access to air front and back, very good sort of through air development, and sort of winding staircases up to the middle. Ironically, Matthew Allen provided the paving slabs to test out some of the material he was trying out at the time, and had his stamp of his name at the bottom of them. And this is outside Hyde Park Barracks. He just cut a hole in the wall and then essentially built it in the wall and said, here's an example, everybody can have a look. And there's quite a few 100,000 people must have seen just this house. And meanwhile in Paris, they're taking a completely different approach, where you have the Parliament was basically they ended up electing Napoleon III. So he was actually the descendant of Napoleon. So you've got this weird sort of scenario where you've elected a president who is actually a descendant of an absolute monarch ruler. So, and then eventually, as all the rights started coming away, in France, this is the response. This is a very large-scale response of cutting through the fabric of the building, as you saw earlier with the barricades. So it's very easy to barricade this, and it's very not easy to barricade that. But this is sort of under the guise of urban development. There was a lot of urban development in terms of providing services for all these houses, because you could put sewers in. But one of the main aspects was you then had to produce a new type of building to face all these streets with. So this was Baron Haussmann, who was one of the main architects of the whole project, and then obviously Napoleon III. And this is a level of density removed out of the urban centre to be able to get to that. So there was hundreds of people, thousands of people in some areas displaced in many of the main streets of Paris. So you can see a difference in scale between how Britain was responding and how France was responding. And this is where reinvention comes in. There's sort of a lot of ideas start coming about that we should maybe look at some ideas on the continent for inspiration and start sharing some ideas. So Sidney Smirke, he was the architect and he was head of the RABA at the time. He was also responsible for the round reading room in the centre of the British Museum. So he was the architect who did that. So he was quite famous. He did quite a few other civic buildings. But he went on to Europe and he was looking into materials and how things were made. And he picked up a sort of like a sort of ground tour. And he managed to learn from Italy how the Roman cement was produced. And their way was using sort of bits of lava from Vesuvius mixed into the cement. It produced this type of fireproof cement, basically. But in Britain, there was no equivalent to this. And these are all the sort of materials that go into being able to produce buildings of a certain size and a certain scale that could never be built before to house all this large number of people. So when he came back, he brought the ideas back, he wrote an article on it, and Matthew Allen read this article. So then he thought, as he worked with before on that previous cottage, and he thought, that material sounds a lot like some of the stuff I'm working on. So he involved some of the ideas here of thinking, well, if there must be equivalent somewhere of the lava from Vesuvius. So he goes to look at the industrial processes that happen around the area, and that's where he comes across concrete, drift coke, and Portland cement, and using them together to create this concrete mix. And that's where he was experimenting with the tiles there. So these materials start being involved in floors, and he starts testing them himself with his own money. So here's an example of a design that he came up with, based on the previous designs by Roberts, inspired by that house. So these floors here are all concrete flat roofs, and you start to see a lot of these components start later on emerging from the Allen estate. So you notice the flat roofs, a lot of the precast concrete components, and it's because they originate in these buildings. And these take all the same ideas through from there. Even some of these window sounds you'll note come from, on the back of the Allen estate, are actually on the fronts of some of these earlier buildings. So this is his design. He shows this off, And this gets a lot of coverage in the architectural press as an idea for working class people. And then he gets investment. And you note the typical size of a Georgian house by compared to these buildings that he started building. And as you can see, these are now fitting into the existing London streets. So you can see they're quite a tall building that is designed to be looked on obliquely. You'd never actually see it from this particular view. This is just to show, for building's sake, how wide it is. But you'd be looking down the street at these processional sections of building as you look down the road. And it was a very unusual type of building for London at the time, but it did spark a lot of interest from the architectural press. And a lot of the ideas from here gradually start filtering through to later buildings. He was looking also, because Smirk looked at buildings in Italy as well, whilst he was doing the work on the reinforced concrete that he came up with. These are some of the example here of Renaissance Revival buildings that were used as reference. So, as you can see, the arcaded centres, the sort of pavilion sides, and this is a summer house, and that is the main house at the Palazzo Farnese. So you can see a lot of the components there that he's recreating. Instead of in stone, he's doing this quite affordable reinforced concrete material. But also the benefits of that is it's fireproof. So when he arrived in London, he was seeing buildings of classical revival and Italianate revival styles, and he then changed into Renaissance revival, and then gradually started coming in French Second Empire. So France was becoming a big influence on his designs. And you'll gradually see how that fades in to form the Allen Estate itself. The Allen Estate itself is very much a French Second Empire style of architecture that's not present in, very rare. There's a few examples around Kensington, and I think a few more sort of towards the outer estates as you go up north, east. And meanwhile in France, we're looking at some of the elevations of some of the buildings that are being used to replace the buildings that were knocked down through these sort of cuts through. And they started producing these types of buildings. And the irony was they don't suit a boulevard, they don't work. So, and simultaneously Matthew Ann's looking at buildings that suit these new types of urban streets that are coming along, and they're also these road regeneration schemes and widening schemes in Britain, and then they're thinking about producing large-scale social housing and also middle-class housing. But as you see, these three examples, when you start doing it, it produces the same thing. And you end up back round again to the Georgian problem. It's like people weren't thinking with the planning of the current period. So these are an example of a set of buildings he produced for Windsor. And there was a dwelling society produced by the king. Ironically, the scheme you saw earlier, the little house for the king, that rolled into this, and the king set up a building company with a group in Windsor, and they produced these as a set of cottages. So as you can see here, lintels above the windows are the same as the Allen Estate. The cornice is also the same as the Allen Estate. So this is the French Second Revival sort of coming into the parts of the design of the houses. But these buildings are weird because at the corners, they're cut out. They're a house bent around an L in the corners. There's a terrace in the middle, and the corners are designed so that the buildings are looked at these unusual angles, because the way the estate was, you approached it from the corners, from open areas. So he's thinking about buildings, instead of just being this sort of front-on projection, he's thinking about buildings, how they perform as part of a street environment already. So you also notice the chimneys as well, also same as the Allen Estate as well. Ironically, these roofs here on the sides leaked badly, but because they were a very early experiment, but that type. But he did fix them. There's a little article in the newspaper saying he kept coming back and he left his scaffold on site to make sure that when he left it, it was completely fixed. And then he says they had little jokes in there, joking between them and the council members about how it was done. But they're still standing. They're Grade 2 listed. This here is actually where I live. So this has actually gone through a process of restoration, as you can see here on the side, being repointed properly. And that's a picture of it circa 1910, thereabouts. And as you see here, the lintels again are repeated, and the estate again here. Cornice missing at the current stage, But as you can see in the picture at the top there, they're the cornices on the alternate sets of buildings. So there's two sets of ideas. So that there was a prototype, the Windsor one, and this is the second prototype. These were built just prior, so that's 1866 and 1867, these two. And these are a row of 4 terraces with an end house, all built at the same time, oddly. Seems to be this odd sort of combination of buildings. But, and these ideas help feed into that other building. So there's other bits of the foundations, and there's other features of these buildings that coalesce. Also, the bricks come from Godmanchester, a town near Huntingdon, and he took them to King's Cross Station, the giant goods yard, and shipped 60-odd thousand bricks every so often to build all of these different types of buildings in London. Because the first ones he built went brown. He says they looked at he built the buildings with Georgian bricks, and as soon as the soot got on them, they turned brown. And he says, I can't carry on with this. And there's a whole article in the newspaper saying, I can't carry on building buildings like this because they're all turning brown. And they're starting to look like the buildings from before. So these are sort of like a slightly glazed, and they're also what the Allen estate is built from. So the same bricks again. And this is a bit of my own research. There's a reconstruction of an original Allen fireplace taken from moulds that I produced using plywood. And I contacted the British Library to get his patent, and I patent cast it and painted it according to the actual paint sample taken from that, which is part of the top of one of these columns. And that's actually exactly constructed how it was in the wall as it would have looked, because the neighbouring house, which is my folks' house, has the same one. So I recast that. And these are the same fireplaces you'd expect to see originally in some of the Allen buildings. So this gives you a bit of a flavour of what the interior spaces would have looked like in some of those buildings. And this is the sort of recreation of that marble. So some of them would have probably been white as well. It all depends on what the individual would have wanted. So in the 1870s was a reform where things actually started to happen, and people started looking at what they'd done and sort of reassessing things up to that stage. So, as you see, coming back to France again, the boulevards that have now been built, this new width and this now inspiring Britain, you've noticed it's difficult to barricade these now. So these barricades can clearly be cleared by horse. So there's no, they have done their job in terms of the Napoleon III. But the funny thing is they still haven't, again, dressed the street, as you can see. The street itself still follows those rules of Georgian architecture, of buildings just repetition down the street. And it doesn't actually address this new type of civic street you've created, the boulevard. And there were schemes in Britain that were much smaller, and this was in Bethnal Green. And this is one of the best examples of the stuff he did in the French Revival style that wasn't, that has all the same components. This is very much closer to the Allen estate. This is where he starts coming up to the Allen estate. The Allen estate's 1873 to 1875. So we're talking 1872 here. And it's part of a road changing scheme. So with small scale schemes of widening roads, changing directions of roads, but as this is mandating putting back good quality housing to replace the bad quality housing. So a lot of these would have been some of the Georgian houses you saw earlier, but by this point, completely worn away. And this was as a result. This is the French Second Empire style. And as you can see here, you'll note the cornices again from the Allen estate and the Windsor houses. The strips from the house that we live in here, the little made using corrugated iron, would you believe, to make the sort of corrugated patination. And then he's thinking about buildings not only vertically anymore, but he's linking them together using these cornices. And this you'll see across the Allen estate, this sort of tied cornices, and that's very much a French Second Empire aspect. You're trying to make a scene, but you're not trying to make it repetitive. And as you see around here, the buildings change. They're actually part of the same block, would you believe? And they wrap around the estate and change the streetscape on that corner. And they are Columbia Road in Bethnal Green. And that's the original colours. They actually restored that all back to the original paint colours. So, and of course, just aside, the flat roof was for dry and washing. And also like a little sort of promenade. You could go up there and go for a walk. The press was really taken by these balconies when they first appeared in the early buildings, and there was an instance of one of the press officers turning up at every stage. This is like appearing on a stage set. You go up to every floor and everybody's looking up at you because there was no balconies like that in London at all. There's no space to sort of, you know, have a seat or something. It was just a flat-fronted building and nothing. And as we come to the Allen estate itself proper, you can actually see the estate marked out. And he started at one end, and he worked his way down, which is why the estate itself, even the estate itself, it looks different as you go down the street. He starts in 1873 at this end with rather quite block-type buildings, and gradually sort of breaks them apart as you come down. And the estate, Bethune Road, is sort of like between two rivers. I think there's a River Lee up there, and the old river other river used to run up here for the reservoir. So I think that's where partly the name originates from. I think there was some sort of input across the thing, because there were a lot of builders involved in different schemes. And there's some that were more French-leaning, and one that were more sort of late classical theming. So, and this is the example of the first blocks. A pair of these blocks are the first set, and as you can see, the bay windows, exactly the same components as used in the earlier social housing, but these are middle-class housing. So these are 9-room flats with generous spaces inside. These two little doors here have very generous 5-room flats for, some of them were estate workers and cleaners. So they also done extra bits in there. So they lived with them on that estate. All these components here are also shared components from them. These are all shared components. Lintels, as they bend round, every single part of this, all of that is reinforced concrete floors, reinforced concrete ceilings, and there's no wood partitions in any of it as it was built. So there's no way for fire to leak from different properties. And there was an architectural firm that restored a lot of them, and they'd done some cut-throughs in the ceilings, and there's about 4 inches thick concrete floors between them. And then they have, on top of that, another 3¼ inch timber joists, and then a timber floor on top of that. So you actually have an air void as well, so the sound doesn't come through either. And that's the first set of blocks, and that's how it would have looked when it was first built. And it's sort of like this lead topper as a sort of decoration around there. And this is the cornice from our house, used at the top. So that's the earliest ones, 1873, and then block type. And these are inspired by the architects that came back again from the French palaces. So there's little aspects of them that are inspired. So you see these pushing of building components right against the edges, hard edges. You would have seen drawings in a lot of the architectural press of a lot of the architectural palaces that come back, and there's like Alfred Waterhouse had done some work in France, and he came back with ideas and drawings. So he was reading all these drawings all the time, up late at night, because it was noted in some of the architectural press that he was doing this. And you can see from some of the French palaces, they take this aspect of pushing things against the hard edge. 2-door entrance routes instead of a singular one. It's not the same, but they're using the ideas in the ways of creating space, rather than thinking about the English way of creating space. You'd sort of partition it quite evenly and have these windows more like this across the space. And it's dealing with different forms of living that are different to what you'd achieve in a Georgian house. So they end up with these odd edge conditions, and you dress them by really leaning into the style of the architecture of which you're going with. So then he then takes the same thing again, second blocks. These are cut back at the top, and they create these roof terraces. And they're sort of like little sunrooms. And it's very similar to the first block, but slightly narrower, I think. And these are also just coming in 1873. There's a pair of these straight down the same road. And then they use the cornice from Windsor and our house. It's sort of like a hierarchy of architectural components there. And the railings also are another feature that are repeated through them. Is another telltale feature. If you see a building with them, they tell you exactly who cast the ironwork. And there was also planting to the edges of these. These were designed specifically for plant boxes, so they are deep enough to achieve that. And these were, I think, 6- and 7-room ones. They're slightly smaller, but it's to accommodate having that extra space at the top. that you wouldn't otherwise have. And he's bringing back some of the features, ironically, from the working class housing, and he's responding to demand. These first two, this block type B and block type A, the one that was more rectilinear and this one, were sold out before he'd even set a brick in the ground. That's how demand they were. So he didn't change them as he was going along. So he was adapting to response and feedback. So there was the feedback from the first block had gone. He was like, oh, okay, fine, we'll change them a little bit and we'll do it this way. And they changed it again. And this takes the aspect of this in regards to the fact that he's thinking about dormers that link and parts of buildings that otherwise wouldn't exist in British architecture at the time. So he was looking at them and thinking, if he's coming up with these plans, how does he resolve those elements once they come into 3 dimensions? Because they would look very awkward if you started using English building language. So let's go back again. Yeah, so this is sort of addressing these central elements where you'd have this weird pavilion-type architecture that's not common to English architecture. And there's some of the sort of core influences there. And now he comes further down. This is where you start going towards the end of the street of the junction. So there's 2 more blocks again. So this is 6. This is 1874 by this point. And he's received a lot of feedback, again, and he's changed these to include these rather French-looking glass rooms. And originally, and now they're currently slated, they would have originally had glass roofs on them. And there were indoor sort of summer gardens on the roofs. So that changed that. He actually lived in a block of this type, and he lived there at number 2. So he actually lived there himself, and various sons and daughters also bought them on different parts of the street and lived in the same area. So, and this is the one actually at the corner of the junction, for example. And this is how it would have looked when it was original. Now, please note the mansard tower built around a chimney stack. And it's not there presently. The tower was taken down, I think, because they're quite hard things to maintain, because unless you've got decent slaters and timber, carpenters to actually reassemble them, then they don't last very long if they're not maintained well. But this was sort of a lookout, would you believe? Because I was told from the houses before, the one we live in, there was originally a roof access hut on the roof, built in a cottage style. And I was told that they would be used, his brother John used to live there, and he had a telescope to look out to see the builder's yard, to see materials coming in and going. I thought, that's rubbish. That was told by my great aunt. And she used to laugh and say, I'm not sure how true that is, though. Well, we found the telescope. So, 1860 on it as well. So, it also comes from London. So, there's some decent age to it. So, we presume there is a Matthew Allen telescope somewhere, from about the same time for this one, because the road here, if you follow it up, goes up north far enough that you can actually link it together as part of the Great North Road. So building materials were also coming in through there, as well as also bits of the railway. So there's very eccentric sort of ideas involved in some of this stuff at this point. So, and also up here, a lot of the components for these panels are in here as well. They create these little arcaded rooms across the tops of the terraces. And it's surprising to see this level of chimney stack completely unsupported, and it's still there. But this, now, unusually, there was some sort of research done into some of the parts of the gardens, and you'll see it a little bit after this, and there was reference to Fontainebleau, which is the palace of Napoleon I that was taken over after the earlier French king. So he reoccupied this palace and done it up, essentially. And then looking at that palace, if you notice the proportions, the 2, which is a very similar sort of French element, the central portion, the mansard roofs, and this was coming out in the architectural press at the time. This was showing people, these are features if you want to do Second Empire style, this is what you do. But, obviously, the stone being from France, you can't get the stone. What's the best nearest equivalent? A buff Cambridgeshire or Arlesey brick. So you're sort of trying to do these things for a different class of people that now wouldn't have been achievable before. So you would have seen those Georgian houses that people would have lived in. they would never have ever even conceived of being able to afford something like this, because all these components reduce the cost of the building down significantly. So, and there's Fontainebleau. And then as we go to the building further down, round the corner, these are the ones, the smaller ones. So essentially you truncated them, and these become 5 rooms. But they're much more deeper. And they're more responding to the gardens behind in a different manner. So the previous ones used to have at the back had French doors with concrete reinforced steps that go down and little balconettes. And they respond to this broad lawn. These ones are responding to a much shallower lawn that's cut off slightly by the railway. But as we were talking about earlier about the large houses of London, across the opposite side of the railway tracks was significant manor houses along quite like those tree-lined roads you saw earlier at the presentation by Amir, that was talking about the big houses with the large gardens sort of in those tree-lined avenues. That was opposing the railway. So the view out of these was functionally uninterrupted by the railway. So these respond in a slightly different manner at the back. And as you can see at the top here, he's responded differently to the staircase. He's created these hexagonal components at the top that's looking, these windows are diagonal and look down the streets to this flat. So it's responding in a different way to the previous building rather than looking front on. It's quite a wide street. It's slightly narrower on Manor Road. And that's how it would have looked originally. And you can just see these sort of weird hexagonal element in the middle. And these little components also come from, again, these. Very distinct, running that cornice on that hexagonal component, picking that out as a feature. So these, you would have seen drawings, elevational drawings of these, again, the architectural press, that have inspired aspects of the buildings that you thought, how can I resolve those issues using these ideas? So, and these are the ones opposite. These are the ones that are not included. And everybody thinks these aren't part of Anne's estate. They are. They're actually across the road on Manor Road. So there's 3 of these. This is the centre one. And these are the ones either side of it. And they're basically functionally 2 up, 2 down terraces. And one is a 3 up at the back and 2 down at the front. So you've got quite a sort of unusual step up at the back. And that's how they would have looked originally. So you can see the sort of same pediment element in the centre, all the same features used again. And there you can see the zinc roofs that go up at the back with a 3-storey element at the back with views looking up and over the gardens. And looking across the gardens themselves, you can see the French mansard roof up there of the second block away from the corner. Here, this is the first block here. That's the first one. Second one, looking down Bethune Road. This here is the corner of Manor Road coming back onto yourself. And these are the gardens. So quite extensive in terms of their layout. You've actually got vineries and sheds and all kinds of other components down that side of the garden. So remember I was saying earlier about Fontainebleau, confirming it. Sally Haywell, for the Allen Gardens group themselves, done a lot of research into the plants and the varieties that are available, including rare ones. So rare that they even come from as far away as California. And also some of the plants themselves, they discovered 80 different varieties. I'm sure there were more. And there was a note in the book that he produced. He produced a little pamphlet on the estate himself, Matthew Allen, and it pointed out they were producing so many thousand bedding plants every year. And it worked out to be they had to plant 27 bedding plants a day to achieve the amount of plants that were needed for those gardens. And yes, we worked out by the access behind the railway line. The railway line would have probably brought the first set of plants and trees to plant the estate. So the Fontainebleau trees, the wild service trees, came from Fontainebleau, which is where that palace sits. So we can now also draw back again that that reference to the architecture was also in the planting schemes as well. I was quite amazed when I saw this, because it's actually on Hackney Council's website. And there's the gardens taken from an aerial view. So they've got Bethune Road running here, and Manor Road running this way. And there's the houses. And these are the extensive gardens. And that view you saw earlier was taken atop this two-storey building here, which no longer exists. And I really desperately want a photograph of it, if somebody's got one, because you can't find it anywhere. But it's very interesting. So breaking down that, what you just saw, we'll just quickly flip between, does everybody sort of understand what's going on here with the railway line? Back of the houses, gardens, and there's obviously the newer estates being built over there, on the back, on the land of the old grand Georgian houses that backed onto the railway. So this is probably 1930s, I think, aerial photograph. So if you come across there, this is the layout as it would have been, because Matthew Allen done a walkthrough. He walked from this end of the estate, through the estate, and described every single element of it as he walked through it. If you just follow it through and you just literally mark it off, you can actually follow along perfectly. And it just shows there that this building was a cottage, called the Cottage, and it actually involved a garden piano room and a billiard room on top. This is a two-storey building, reinforced concrete floors, and it was considerably large. It had a dance hall space in there as well. Piano, it was usable by the local people, it was rentable, and it had smoking room in there as well. So this is the drive as it was, comes from the corner. You put your cart in the corner here, comes into a cart shed. You have a coach house here, sorry. And you have the stabling here, it's the general stable yard. This is fenced off from the railway. There's a reinforced concrete promenade that runs pretty much the length of half of one half of the estate and the entire length of the other. And it's brickwork with masonry walls, and then it's a reinforced concrete roof on top. Provides the drainage from the roof actually goes into the wash houses. So they use that to wash the floors and that kind of thing. So there is actually a tank to collect them, because on the back of our house there was actually a reinforced concrete tank for grey water to flush the toilets. And that is still actually there in the roof, because it's been sort of enclosed in. So he was thinking about all these unusual ideas as well, simultaneously while thinking about the French influence. But he was trying to, this scheme, instead of earlier with the working class houses, trying to lift them up and sort of address the issues of civil unrest, poverty and those issues, he was trying to do the same thing again for the middle classes and allowing them to live a life where they had this sort of communal living experience, where you have vineries. You even had an on-site gardener that lived in his own house. He would come around every morning with a list, and he would come through with what you wanted for vegetables-wise. And he would plant them, and you'd go them up, you have a whole list of stuff coming through, and you would get to the point where would just be able to order whatever vegetables you wanted, and they would get them from the garden. You'd pay him a little amount of money, and you'd get them. And he was the one who was kept on site. You had vineries, where they grow vines through the construction and into glass houses, actual greenhouses separately. Those are the potting sheds taken over by the gardener. And these, I said about there's different types of buildings. You work your way down the street and around the corner. These buildings here responding to these lawns, and these ones responding with the balconies. Now you have a lawn. On top of that, you have a croquet lawn. So, and he's all surrounded by planting as well. So there are thousands of plants in these. An actual playground. How many times outside of a Victorian school do you see a housing estate built with a playground in 1873? It's just not a thing, really. They just go, here's some housing and some gardens, and that's private. Bowling green as well, also shared. And then there was also a full-scale kitchen garden of an acre, which fed into those things as well. Eventually, the kitchen garden got turned into tennis courts and an extra bowling green, but it's sort of in the 1900s it became very fashionable. So, but they were still doing gardening on site at that point, so they must have sort of taken over the potting shed area and used it as a garden. But the Manor Road sidings you see as well up there, along this wall here, are huge coal bunkers all the way along here, built into the ground. Sort of, this is higher up than the actual railway. They're built into the face of this edge here. And all that coal in that yard helps feed all these buildings. And also you could get all your furniture delivered there. So you talked about Gillow's furniture earlier, for the makers who made the furniture for the town hall at Stoke Newington. Gillow's are a very famous Victorian furniture maker, and you could order an entire bedroom suite in the same matching style. They'd put it in a crate for you, and you could take it to the railway line, order it and pick it up at the station there, and a horse-drawn carriage would break it down, take it down the drive, and then you could have all your furniture brought to your house. So this was, you know, the age of the sort of department store idea and that kind of thing. So you could, it was all served, all your goods could come in, you could have coal, you could have furniture, you could have other goods delivered by that railway siding, which is all closed off now, unfortunately. But that's how they used to get goods into there. Because I was originally looking at just this component, and that's when the railway came into it. And I looked in the railways, and the railway, there's a lot of history on the railways in book form that far surpasses just general architecture. So there was quite a lot of information regarding that. So now you get into the point where it's 1880. Matthew Allen is living in the same estate. He lives at Bethune Road, number 2. So he lives with all the people that he built these houses for. Everybody knows him, and he knows them. And unfortunately, in 1880, that's his house there, number 2, Bethune Road, with a little gold 2. And the same photograph you saw earlier, that might actually be one of his descendant daughters, perhaps. I haven't worked out yet. And there's William Lovett. William Lovett, in 1876 in his diary, writes that he actually visits Matthew Allen, and Matthew Allen's becoming quite ill. So it's 1876, so that's just a year after he's finished building the Allen's estate. And he presents a little model of some of his buildings he built elsewhere in London as a sort of little gift, sort of little joke between them. Because ironically, the Chartists themselves were quite involved in revolutionary architecture, like living off the land little cottages. So between them, there's a sort of little building thing there. And where is it? Unfortunately, Matthew Allen actually succumbed to his illness in the 3rd of February 1880, and the illness he succumbed to was bronchitis and asthma. But that's what they said in his obituary. But looking at it now, understanding medicine now, it's acute silicosis. And ironically, of all the things he died from, was the ash used to build the houses. He used ash from industrial purposes. And of course, back then, masts and, you know, damping down things were not a thing. Watering down buildings, you see construction sites with big hoses soaking them down. And the sand, the lime, the ash, all those components contributed towards that. So the irony was that the thing that actually he used to help build all these amazing buildings for people, from working classes right up to the middle classes, actually was the thing that actually finished him off in the end. But I think in the end, I think he would have been glad that so many people could benefit from being able to access buildings and a quality of life they wouldn't have otherwise been able to access. So, yeah, that's a little rundown of his life and how it was influenced. And there is his actual booklet for the houses. You can actually download this on Google Books. This is actually free. So he produced that 1 year after he built the buildings, and it describes all of the things of the estate and how it was assembled, all the ideas that went into it, and how he told other people how to be able to build like that and to those standards. Because he actually had a patent for all these components, and he actually rescinded it because he realised people were trying to copy it and building very dangerous buildings. So he rescinded it and gave the patent away for free, and had his friend also work on it as well. William H. Lassell. He worked for the famous Norman Shaw architect. So he also used all those ideas, and those went forward into a lot of country houses as well, making them a lot safer than they would have been with timber beams if they caught fire. So, and all the resources available from Hackney Archives were a great resource for this, because a lot of the photographic evidence you can actually get from their archives, you can actually search, and his stuff is available on there, search by name. So if anyone wants to find out about the Allen estate, there are a lot of photographic archives right through the 70s, even the neglect period. But as far as I know, the estate was owned up until the 60s by the Allen family in London. So whether there's any other information that I've not come across yet, that's essentially it.